She couldn't feel her fingers anymore. The fence wire was slicing her palms, and she couldn't feel it. Her daughter had stopped shivering, and she knew what that meant. She'd learned it from her grandmother. When the body stops shaking, it's surrendering. Ruth Calloway did not surrender. Post by post, through a Wyoming blizzard that had already killed the driver, she followed a fence line toward a yellow square of light, and a man she had lied to, who would become the only home she'd ever truly chosen. On this channel, we live inside the stories the frontier left behind, the grit of women who walked through blizzards, the grief of cowboys who still had love left in them, the tenderness between strangers who became family, and the bond between a mother and her children that no winter, no courtroom, and no cruel man could ever break. This story's gift to you is this: home is not somewhere you find. It is something you build. One meal, one truth, one act of stubborn love at a time. Like this video if it stayed with you. Subscribe so you never miss the next one, and share it. Because somewhere out there, someone needs to be reminded that walking forward is always worth it.
Ruth shoved the coach door open into a wall of white. She clawed her way to the driver's seat. Bill Mercer was a statue, his eyes open and his hands still holding the reins to horses buried chest-deep in snow. She shook him, screaming his name, but he was gone. She checked for a pulse, just like her grandma taught her, pressing her fingers to his frozen neck for what felt like an eternity. Nothing. Climbing down, her numb hands missed the step, and she fell deep into the snow. Back inside the coach, Nora looked at her with the eyes of a woman who had seen too much. "Is he dead, Mama?" Ruth never lied to Nora. "Yes." "Are we going to die too?" "No." Ruth slammed the door, shutting out the storm. Emmy was bundled on the seat, her skin cold as ice. Ruth knew the signs. When the shivering stops, the body is giving up. She ripped open her own coat and pressed Emmy's little body against her bare skin, a desperate attempt to share her warmth. "Stay with me, baby," she pleaded into the wind. "Mama, what do we do?" Nora's voice was calm, too calm for a child. Outside, the world had disappeared into the blizzard. The road was gone. But somewhere out there was a rancher named Jesse Hawkins, a stranger she had deceived, who had a warm fire. "We walk," Ruth said, her voice firm. "Emmy will die if we stay. I saw fence posts a while back. We follow them." Nora looked at her sister's pale face, then pulled on her thin coat. "I'll carry the bag." That simple act of courage from her 7-year-old nearly shattered Ruth. "Stay right behind me," Ruth ordered, her voice thick. "Hold on to my coat and don't you dare let go." She buttoned Emmy inside her own coat, creating a small cocoon against her chest. Then she stepped out into the storm. The wind fought her like a physical enemy, shoving her backward. She stumbled forward until her knees slammed into a fence post. She tasted blood from biting her tongue but pushed herself back up. "Found the fence!" she yelled to Nora. "We follow it!" They moved from one post to the next, counting them off in the blinding snow. Then a new scent cut through the icy air. Wood smoke. Hope surged through her. A fire meant people. Soon after, a faint yellow light appeared in the distance. A window. "Help us!" she screamed, but the wind stole her voice. She found the gate, stumbled across a yard, and finally collapsed against a wooden door. She pounded on it with a fist she could no longer feel. The door flew open. A large man stood there holding a rifle, his face as hard as the Wyoming winter. "Who in the hell are you?" he demanded. "Ruth Calloway," she gasped, struggling to stand. "The driver is dead out on the road. My little girl is dying. Please, I need your fire." Jesse Hawkins looked from Ruth's desperate face to the small, blue-lipped child tucked inside her coat. He stepped aside without a word. "Get in, now." Ruth rushed past him straight to the hearth, where embers still glowed. She fumbled with her coat buttons, pulling Emmy free. "Build up that fire," she ordered, "and get me blankets and warm water." Jesse moved with surprising speed, setting his rifle down to stack logs on the fire and fetch supplies. Just as Ruth finished wrapping Emmy in a warm blanket, Nora appeared in the doorway, a small, snow-covered figure dragging their single bag behind her. "Come here, baby." Ruth held out an arm and Nora scurried to her side, her eyes locked on the strange man and his rifle. Jesse saw the look. He saw the way Nora stood, and he did the math. He turned his head slowly. "Your letter said you were alone." "I know what it said," Ruth answered, her voice trembling. "That's a 7-year-old girl, and this is my 4-year-old Emmy. I'm a widow, and I lied because no man would hire a woman with 2 children in tow. I had to get them somewhere safe." Jesse's jaw was tight as he stood up, and Nora flinched, stepping back to shield her little sister. He saw the move, and something in his hard expression shifted. The anger was still there, but something else joined it. "Who taught her to be that scared of a man?" he asked, his voice low and serious. "Life did," Ruth said. "My husband's brother, Silas. After my husband passed, Silas wanted the house. He made it clear we weren't welcome." Jesse looked right at Nora, not at her mother. "I ain't him," he said directly to the little girl. "You hear me? I am not the man who hurt your mama. Nobody gets hurt on my ranch. You're safe here." Nora just watched him, her old eyes taking in everything. Jesse turned back to Ruth, the weight of the situation settling on him. "The driver's frozen solid. The coach is buried out there somewhere. You picked one hell of a time to show up, Mrs. Calloway." "I didn't pick the blizzard," she shot back. "No," he said, rubbing his face, "but you picked the lie. Now I've got a dead man to answer for and 3 extra mouths to feed in a winter that's fixin' to bury us all." He paused, looking at the 2 small girls by his fire. "Silas," he said, "does he know where you are?" Ruth didn't answer. She couldn't. And that silence was the most terrifying answer of all. Emmy made a small sound, and Ruth looked down to see the color finally coming back to her little girl's cheeks. The warmth of the fire was doing its job. Ruth felt her forehead. She was warming up and her pulse felt a little stronger. Jessie just watched as Ruth expertly rubbed the life back into her child's hands and feet. She knew what she was doing, like a real doctor. "My grandmother was a healer back in Missouri," she said. "Taught me about herbs and fevers. There is not a doctor for 30 miles around here." The last one cleared out before the first snow. Jesse said it like he was talking about the weather. Ruth looked him square in the eye. "Well, I can doctor. I can also cook, keep your books, sew, make soap, and put up food for the winter. I can teach children their letters and numbers. I can do any job you need done. My name is Ruth Calloway, and I will work harder than any woman you could ever find because I have everything to lose." She pulled Emmy closer. "My daughters are not part of any bargain. You take me, you take them. In return, I will make this ranch run better than it has since your wife passed. That is not a boast. That is a promise." The room got real quiet with just the sound of the crackling fire. Jesse stared at this half-frozen woman on his floor, laying down terms like she held all the cards. She was broke, stuck, and helpless until spring. He knew it and she knew it. And still, she was the one setting the conditions. "What was her name?" Ruth asked, her voice steady. Jesse blinked. "What are you talking about? Your wife? What was her name?" "Margaret." "How long has she been gone?" 14 months. How did she pass?" Jesse's shoulders went tight. "That is not your business." "It is my business if I am to sleep in her house. I need to know what I am walking into." Nobody had spoken to Jesse Hawkins that way for more than a year. Folks in town walked on eggshells around his sorrow. But this woman, still shivering with her child barely breathing in her arms, she asked him straight. "Childbirth," he finally said, his voice low. The baby did not make it either. Ruth closed her eyes for a moment. "I am truly sorry." "Do not be sorry," he said sharply. "Just be what you promised. Cook, clean, earn your keep." He grabbed his coat from a peg by the door. "Room's at the end of the hall. The bed is made. There is a lock on the door." As he pulled on his boots, a blast of cold air filled the room. "Where are you going?" Ruth asked. The horses need seeing to, he said, and I need to think about what in the hell just happened to my life. He stopped at the door. Jesse. He paused but did not turn. Thank you for letting us in. Do not thank me yet, Mrs. Calloway. We have a long winter ahead, and we're going to have a serious talk about that lie of yours real soon. Then he stepped out into the storm and shut the door. Ruth let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding all the way from Missouri. Her whole body ached, but Emmy was warm and breathing, and they were inside. Nora sat beside her watching the door. He is mad, Mama. He has a right to be. But he gave us a room with a lock. Yes, he did. Uncle Silas took the lock off our door, did not he? Ruth pulled Nora close, holding both her girls tight. This is not Uncle Silas's house. Nora was quiet for a bit, listening to the fire. Mama? Yes, darling. He said, thank you for opening the door. I did. I am not scared of him. Ruth kissed the top of her head. I know you are not. You are the bravest girl I know, Nora Calloway. Much braver than me. Nora snuggled in closer. I will watch him. If he is a bad man, I will know. I always know first. I know you do, baby. Mama, I am hungry. A small smile almost touched Ruth's lips. All right then, let us see what this cowboy keeps in his pantry. She gently laid Emmy by the fire, wrapped in blankets, and got to her feet. The kitchen was a sight. Dirty dishes were piled high, flour was spilled everywhere, and a pot on the stove held something that had given up on being soup days ago. It was the kitchen of a man lost in his own sadness. 14 months of a man grieving all alone. You could see it on every dusty surface, in the crooked curtains, and in the dead garden outside the window buried under all that snow. Ruth found some bread that was hard but not spoiled. She found butter in a cold box and a jar of peaches, probably put up by Margaret the summer before she passed. She sliced the bread, spread the butter, and opened the peaches, setting a plate down for Nora. Eat slow now. Your stomach is not used to it. Nora ate like she was afraid it would disappear. Ruth watched her, feeling that old familiar sting behind her eyes from 6 months of feeding her children first. She made herself eat a slice of bread and a few peaches. She had to keep her own strength up. Through the window, she could see a lantern lit in the barn. Jessie was out there thinking things over. Her husband used to talk to the mules when he had a problem to work through. He always said they were better listeners than people. Ruth washed their plate and put it away. She checked on Emmy, whose cheeks were now pink. Her breathing was deep and even. She was sleeping a real sleep. Ruth carried her down the hall to the room Jessie had mentioned. It was small and clean, with a bed and a quilt that smelled fresh. And just like he said, there was a solid brass lock on the inside of the door. He had even oiled it for her. He had known she would need it to feel safe. She tucked Emmy into the bed, and Nora climbed in right beside her sister, wrapping an arm around her without a word. Mama, are we going to stay here? For now, baby. The snow has us penned in. Is the cowboy man going to let us stay when the snow melts? Ruth sat on the bed and smoothed Nora's hair. I am going to work so hard that he cannot imagine this place without us. That is what we do, Nora. We make ourselves necessary. This time is different, though. This time we are not just passing through, we are planting roots. Nora thought on that. Roots are good. Things with roots do not get blown away. That is exactly right. Ruth locked the door, checking it twice. Then she sat in the chair by the window and finally let herself tremble. Not from the cold, but from the fear she had been fighting for 6 long months. They had made it. They were in a warm house with a locked door, and a man who, for all his anger, had carried a sick child in from the storm. Emmy was alive. Nora had food in her belly. And outside, Jesse Hawkins was in his barn, probably wondering what he had gotten himself into. Ruth closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would make that man the best breakfast he had eaten in 14 months. She would clean his house until it shined and prove she was worth all the trouble. Tonight, she would just breathe. In and out. From the bed, Emmy stirred. Her little hand reached out, then her lips moved, making the softest sound. The first word she had said to anyone but Nora in 3 months. Warm. Ruth covered her mouth and cried silently. One single word from a child who had been scared into silence. It was not much, but it was everything. The blizzard howled outside, but the fire burned bright inside. In that little room, 3 lives were balanced between a desperate lie and a locked door, between a woman's will to survive and a man's heavy grief. Ruth had built her life on less than this before. She could surely do it again. She woke before the sun was up, with Emmy's hand balled up in her dress. The house was quiet and cold. She slipped out of the bed, careful not to wake the girls, and went to the main room. In just a few minutes, she had the fire going again. In the daylight, the kitchen looked even worse. Grease was thick on the stove, and a burnt skillet sat there, looking pitiful. She found some coffee, put a pot on to boil, and then she rolled up her sleeves. She was up to her elbows in cold, soapy water when she heard boots on the porch. The door swung open and Jesse walked in, his arms full of firewood. He stopped cold when he saw her there. "Well, you are up." Jesse found the wood stacked neatly by the fireplace. He looked around the kitchen, seeing the clean dishes and the steaming coffee pot. Ruth stood there, still in yesterday's dress, her sleeves rolled up. "You did not have to start on chores," he told her. "You almost died in that storm." "Almost does not count," she replied. "Your kitchen, on the other hand, was another story." A tiny twitch pulled at his mouth. "Margaret took better care of it." "I'm sure she did." Ruth dried her hands. "Sit down. If you have eggs, I will have breakfast ready in 10 minutes. The chickens are out back in the coop. Tom gets the eggs in the morning. He is the ranch hand, a good boy of 19 who lives in the bunkhouse." Jesse pulled a chair out but did not sit. "He is checking on the driver. We will have to bury Bill Mercer once the ground is soft enough to dig." Ruth gave a slight nod. The weight of the man's death settled back on her. A young man then burst through the back door, stomping snow from his boots and carrying a basket of eggs. He was tall and lean, with a boy's face and cold red hands. He stopped short when he saw Ruth. "Tom, this is Mrs. Calloway," Jesse said. "She arrived last night." Jesse's voice was flat. "She will be staying with us." Tom's eyes darted from Jesse to Ruth and back again. "Yes, sir." "Ma'am." He placed the eggs on the counter and hurried back outside, forgetting to close the door. "He is just shy," Jesse offered. "You told him one woman was coming, and I showed up with 2 children in a blizzard." "I have not told him about the children yet." "Well, you better tell him before he walks in and drops a whole basket of eggs." Jesse finally took a seat. Ruth cracked 6 eggs into a skillet. She was angry, not at Jesse, but at herself for the lie that circumstances had forced upon her. She was angry at the world for making honesty a choice she could not afford. She put a plate of eggs and toast in front of Jesse, along with strong black coffee. He stared at it for a moment. "This is..." He picked up his fork. "Thank you. Do not thank me. Just eat." Ruth poured her own coffee and leaned against the counter. She would not sit with him. Not yet. When he was finished, he pushed his plate away and held the warm cup in both hands. "All right, Mrs. Calloway, your daughters are safe. You are warm. Now it is time we talked." Ruth set down her cup. "Ask what you need to. Why did you lie?" "Because I was desperate. I thought the truth would cost my girls their only chance." "You were right about that," Jesse said, his voice empty of emotion. "I advertised for one woman, someone to cook and clean, and maybe, down the road, a wife. I was not looking for a family. I buried my own child, a baby girl, right next to her mother in the south field. I swore I would never go through that kind of pain again." His hands gripped the cup tighter. "And now you have brought 2 little girls into my house without giving me any choice in the matter." The words hit Ruth hard because she knew he was right. "You had a choice," she said softly. "You could have left us on the porch. In a blizzard? With a child turning blue?" Jesse's voice was filled with disbelief. "What kind of man do you take me for?" "I think you are the kind of man who opens his door in a storm." It is why I chose you, Jesse. Your advertisement was the only one that asked for a woman of good character, not one who was young and pretty. You were looking for a person, not property. Jesse just stared at her. That does not make the lie acceptable. No, it does not, Ruth admitted, crossing her arms. I will not make excuses for it. But my girls, Nora and Emmy, are not up for discussion. If you want me gone come spring, I will go. But they go with me. Always. I'm not sending anyone out in the winter. We have time, then. Let me prove my worth. Give me until the spring. Let me show you that we will not be a burden. Jesse stood and walked to the window, his back to her. Emmy, he said, the little one. Why does she not talk? She talks but only whispers to Nora. Why? It was hard for Ruth to speak. After my husband died, his brother Silas took the house. He wanted us gone. He would come into our room at night and threaten to take the girls if I did not leave. Jesse turned around sharply from the window. He never laid a hand on them, Ruth said quickly. I made sure of it. But Emmy heard him night after night. A big man yelling in the dark. One morning, she just went silent. Nora says she still talks to her when they are alone. She said the word warm last night. It was the first word I've heard her say in 3 months. Jesse's face became very still, like a storm gathering under the surface. Where is this Silas now? In Missouri, far as I know. He does not know where we are. Does he have a legal claim on the girls? The question she feared. He is their closest male relative. He could petition for custody. Say I am an unfit mother. But you are not. You have a job here. Ruth looked straight at him. Do I? Jesse met her gaze. Through the winter you do. We will see about the rest. It was not forgiveness, but it was a start. A small noise came from the hallway. Nora stood there, holding Emmy's hand. The little one hid behind her sister, peeking at Jesse. Mama, Emmy is hungry. Ruth started toward them, but Jesse spoke first. He knelt down slowly. There are eggs and toast on the stove. Your mama made them. Do you want to come eat? Nora sized him up, her eyes taking in everything. We can get it ourselves, she said. We do not need your help. Nora, Ruth began to scold. I know you do not need it, Jesse said gently. I am offering it. That is what folks do for each other in a house. Nora thought about this, then led Emmy to the table and climbed into a chair. Emmy sat beside her, so small her chin did not reach the tabletop. Ruth brought them each a plate and sat with them. Jesse stood by the fireplace, giving them space. Nora ate quickly with one arm curved around her plate. Emmy ate slowly, each bite a careful act. Good eggs, Nora said. Better than what we had at the church. Jesse grabbed his hat from a hook. I will be in the barn for most of the day. The storm is letting up, but the cattle need to be checked. Tom and I will be back around dark. He stopped at the door, looking right at Ruth. He said, There is flour and salt in the pantry, and dried beef in the cellar. The garden is dead under all that snow, but there are preserves on the shelf in the back room. Margaret put them up last summer. He spoke his dead wife's name the same way he said everything else, flat and careful, like a man walking on thin ice. He told her, If you need anything you cannot find, ask Tom when he comes back. I will manage. I know you will. He put on his hat. I have seen your kind of stubborn before. Is that a compliment or a complaint? I have not decided yet. Then he was gone. The door closed. Cold air settled in the room. Nora looked at her mother. He is still mad about the lie. Yes. Are you going to say sorry again? No. I am going to show him sorry. Words are cheap, Nora. Actions are what count. Ruth stood up and started gathering plates. Finish eating, then we work. And they worked. Ruth went after that house like it owed her a debt. She scrubbed the kitchen floor on her hands and knees while Nora wiped down every shelf. She cleaned the stove until the old iron gleamed. She took stock of the pantry, counting every jar and every sack. She found Margaret's preserves all lined up with careful labels: strawberry, peach, green tomato, and plum. Each one was a small monument to a woman who planned for a future she never got to see. Ruth touched the jars gently and left them exactly as they were. By midday, she had started on the mending. Most of it was just simple work. A missing button here, a split seam there. She sat by the fire with the basket while Nora read aloud from an old book of animal stories. Emmy sat on the floor, drawing on a piece of brown paper with some charcoal Nora found. Ruth watched Emmy draw. The small, careful strokes became a shape that looked like a house. Then another shape right beside it with something like smoke coming from the top. A chimney. Emmy was drawing this very house, this chimney, this fire. Ruth's hands stopped working. She watched her daughter make something from nothing, and she felt a sliver of hope crack through her chest like a green shoot through frozen earth. "That is beautiful, Emmy," she said softly. Emmy kept drawing, but her hand moved a little faster. She added a small figure beside the house, then another small figure, then a bigger one. 3 people standing together next to a house with a warm fire. Nora leaned over for a better look. "That is us, Emmy. Right, is us, Emmy. That is me and you and Mama." Emmy nodded her head. Then she drew one more figure standing apart from the others, all by himself. "Who is that?" Nora asked. Emmy whispered something that Ruth could not quite hear. Nora listened, then looked at her mother with a serious face. "She says it is the cowboy man. She says he looks cold standing out there all alone." Ruth looked down at the drawing. 4 figures, 3 together and 1 standing apart. It was a little girl's simple understanding of the truth. "Maybe tomorrow," Ruth said carefully. "You could draw him a little closer to us." Emmy looked up at her mother for the first time all day. She had those big brown eyes just like her father, full of things she could not put into words. Then she looked back at her paper and drew a line between the lone figure and the others. She did not move him closer, but she connected them. It was enough. It was more than enough. Jessie and Tom came back at dusk, stamping snow from their boots, smelling of horse in the cold air. Jessie stopped just inside the door. The floor was clean. The dishes were all put away. A pot of stew was simmering on the stove, filling the house with warmth. The mending basket was empty. He stood there looking at his own kitchen like he had walked into the wrong house by mistake. Tom let out a low whistle. "Well, I will be. Sit down," Ruth said from the stove. "Both of you, dinner is ready." Tom sat down right away, the way a young man does when a woman offers him a hot meal. Jessie moved a lot slower. He took off his hat and hung up his coat. His eyes found the chair where the mending pile used to be. Then he noticed the clean floor. He saw his coffee cup, washed and sitting on the shelf right where Margaret always used to keep it. "You did not have to do all this," he said quietly. "Yes, I did." Ruth ladled stew into their bowls. It was made with beef, potatoes, and carrots from the preserves. "Eat before it gets cold." Nora sat at the table with her arms crossed, watching Jessie like a hawk. Emmy stayed in the corner by the fire, as far from the men as she could get. Jessie tasted the stew. Something in his face changed. He took another bite and then another. Tom was already on his second bowl. "This is the best thing I have eaten in a long time." Jessie stopped. "This is good." Margaret's preserves helped. She knew what she was doing. Jessie's jaw tightened when he heard her name, but he nodded. She did. They finished their meal in silence. Afterward, Tom went out to the bunkhouse. Jessie stayed at the table while Ruth cleared the dishes. "I found something in the back room," Ruth said, her hands in the wash water. "A cradle. It is small and handmade from cedar wood, I think." Jessie went completely still. "I did not move it. I just wanted you to know that I saw it." Ruth kept washing, not looking at him. "You made it for the baby." "Do not. You are a good carpenter. The joints are perfect." "I said do not." His voice came out ragged and torn. Ruth turned around. Jessie was sitting at the table with his head in his hands, his shoulders hunched up like he was waiting for a blow. She dried her hands slowly and sat across from him. She did not touch him. She just sat there. I am not going to pretend it is not there, Jesse. You lost your wife and your baby. That pain is in every corner of this house. I cannot clean around it, and I will not try to. What do you want me to say? Nothing. Ruth folded her hands on the table. I have my own losses. We can carry them separately, or we can at least be honest that they exist. Jesse lifted his head. His eyes were red, but they were dry. You are a hard woman, Ruth Calloway. I am a surviving woman. There is a difference. He stared at her from across the table. This stranger who had invaded his house and refused to look away from the things he had been hiding from for 14 months. He should have been furious, and he was. But underneath the anger, something else was stirring. It felt a lot like relief. Someone finally saw. Someone was not pretending. The cradle stays where it is, he said finally. Of course it does. And the preserves on the shelf. Those were Margaret's. I know. I will not use them without asking. Use them. The word came out rough. She made them to be used. She would hate knowing they were just sitting there gathering dust while people went hungry. Ruth nodded. Then I will use them well. Jesse stood up, pushed in his chair, and then stopped at the hallway. Mrs. Calloway. Ruth, if I am cooking your meals and mending your socks, you can use my name. Ruth. He tested the name. That's stew tonight. Margaret used to make something similar. It was not the same. Yours had something different in it. Thyme. I found dried thyme in a jar. It was good. Different, but good. He paused. I will see you in the morning. You will. Then he disappeared down the hall. Ruth heard his door close. She finished the dishes and banked the fire for the night. Then she went to her room where her daughters slept, curled together like two puppies. Nora's arm was thrown over Emmy. Emmy's hand clutched that piece of brown paper with the charcoal drawings. Ruth gently eased the paper from her fingers and held it up to the moonlight. The house with the chimney, the three figures together, and the one figure apart. And between them all was a line, drawn by a child who could not speak, but who could still reach out. Ruth pressed the drawing to her chest. Outside, the snow had finally stopped. The stars were bright and sharp in the cold night sky. She thought about Jesse in his room, lying in the bed he had shared with Margaret. She thought about the cradle in the back room, empty and perfect, built by his own hands. Her arms felt empty, made for a child she no longer had. She wondered if Silas was out there searching for them, a dark cloud on the horizon. Then her mind turned to little Amy's drawing, that one little line connecting a lonely man to their small family. It was a strange thing for a girl so scared of men to do. Ruth Calloway just closed her eyes. Tomorrow she'd get up and make breakfast. She'd scrub the floors. She would earn another day in this house that wasn't hers. But Lord willing, it could be. You build a life from dust one day at a time, one meal at a time. She had done it before, and she'd do it again. The days just piled on top of each other. A week went by, then two. The snow came down hard, burying the whole world in white silence. Ruth kept her promise. She cooked and she cleaned. She mended every tear and darned every sock. She even organized the pantry so Jesse could find what he was looking for. She learned the quirks of that old stove and made bread from scratch since town was buried under 3 feet of snow. Jesse, well, he kept his distance. He'd talk at meals, but it was all business about fence posts and feed. He only spoke to Nora when the girl spoke first, which was hardly ever. He didn't speak a word to Emmy, and Emmy never even looked his way. The space between them grew into a canyon of its own. But Ruth was always watching. She saw how Jesse left a fresh stack of firewood by the door each morning before the sun was up. She saw him one night, whittling a small wooden horse and leave it on the kitchen table without a sound. Amy found it the next morning and held it tight while she drew by the fire. She saw him teach Tom how to cook porridge one morning when she'd been up all night with Emmy's cough. Breakfast was waiting when she finally stumbled out. He never said a word about any of it, and Ruth never brought it up. but she tucked each kindness away, building a picture of a man who couldn't speak his heart, but couldn't stop showing it. On the 15th morning, Nora finally cornered Jessie in the barn. Tom told her about it later, looking like he'd seen a ghost. Ruth had sent Nora for eggs, but she took a little detour. "Your horses are looking thin," Nora said, standing there with her basket. Jessie glanced up from the bridle he was fixing. "They're winter horses. They always get a little lean. Mama says animals only get skinny when folks don't feed 'em right. Your mama has an opinion about most things, and she's usually right." Nora marched right in, stopped at a stall, and eyed the bay horse inside. When it lowered its head, she jumped back. "He won't bite," Jessie said. "That's Dutch. Dumb as a post, but gentle. I'm not scared." "I can see that. You're not scared of much, are you?" Nora turned right to him. "I'm scared of some things." "Like what?" "Like men who act all nice, and then just stop." Jessie put the bridle down. He didn't get up, just sat on the hay and looked at her. "Your uncle. First week he brought us candy. Told Mama he'd take care of us. Called me his pretty girl." Nora's voice was flat, like she was reading a grocery list. "Then the candy stopped. Then the niceness stopped. Then he started coming into our room at night." "Nora, you don't have to tell me this." "I'm telling you so you know," she said, lifting her chin. "I know how men work. They're nice to get what they want. Then they get it and they're done. So I'm watching you, Jessie Hawkins. I watch what you do when you think no one's looking." Jessie was quiet for a good long while. "So what have you seen?" he finally asked. "While you've been watching." Nora thought for a second. "You leave firewood so Mama don't have to go out in the cold. You carved Amy a horse but left it for her to find 'cause you know she's scared. You eat Mama's cooking and say it's good even when the beans were burned last Tuesday. The beans weren't that burned. They were pretty burned." A little smile almost touched Jessie's face. "Anything else?" "You talk to your dead wife at night. I can hear you through the wall. You tell her you're sorry." The smile disappeared. Jessie just stared at his hands. "I'm not spying," Nora said real fast. "The walls are just thin. I didn't mean to hear." "And what do you think about a man talking to a dead woman?" "I think it's sad," Nora said, clutching her basket. "I talk to my daddy sometimes, too, in my head. I tell him I'm trying to keep Mama and Amy safe just like he asked me." "He asked you to do that?" "Last thing he ever said. Nora, girl, you watch over your mama and your sister. You're the strong one." Then the mine collapsed and he never came back. Jess pressed his knuckles to his mouth and breathed. His voice came out raw. "That is a heavy burden to put on a child." "I'm not a child. I'm the strong one." "You can be both," Jessie said, leaning forward. "Now you listen to me, Nora. I am not your uncle. I'm not going to be nice for a spell and then turn mean. I'm going to be this difficult and this quiet for as long as you know me. What you see is what you get." That's what Uncle Silas said, too. I reckon he did. So you just keep watching. You watch me all winter if it makes you feel safe. And if I ever do anything, anything at all, that makes you or your sister feel scared, you tell your mama and you tell me. And we will fix it. Deal?" Nora, just 7 years old, stood there holding the weight of her father's last words, deciding if she could trust again. Jessie just waited. "Deal," she finally said. "But I'm still watching." "I'd expect nothing less." Nora turned and walked out with the eggs. Jessie sat there for a long time after she left. That evening, Nora moved her chair one seat closer to Jessie at the dinner table. Nobody said a thing, but everybody saw it. The third week, the weather broke, and a visitor showed up. Ruth heard the crunch of hooves on snow and looked out the window. An old woman on a gray mare was riding up, bundled in so many quilts she looked like a little mountain. Jessie came out of the barn. "Hattie, what in the world are you doing out here?" "Checking on you, you stubborn old fool. Heard from Tom you got a woman and kids out here. Figured I'd better come see before it turns into a whole county scandal. The old woman slid off that horse easier than you'd think. Help me inside. My bones are frozen clear through. Jessie took the horse, and the woman marched up, pushed the door open, and found Ruth standing there with a ladle in her hand. "Lord have mercy," Hattie Perkins said, pulling off her gloves and looking Ruth over. "You're the one from the advertisement." "I am. And I reckon these are the children he didn't know about. Word gets around fast. Honey, out here, word's the only thing that moves fast in the winter." Hattie went straight to the fire. "I'm Hattie Perkins, live 6 miles west. I was a mail-order bride myself 42 years ago, so don't you worry. I'm not here to pass judgment." Ruth felt a weight lift off her chest. "Would you care for some coffee?" "I'd prefer whiskey, but coffee will have to do." Hattie sat down and saw little Emmy peeking from behind Ruth's skirts. "And who is this little thing?" "That's Emmy. She doesn't talk much." "Doesn't or won't?" Ruth paused. "Won't. She's been through some things." Hattie nodded, like that explained everything. "I was the same after my first husband passed. Didn't say a word for 2 months. Folks thought I'd lost my mind. I was just checking if the world was safe enough for words again." She looked right at Emmy. "You take your time, little one. The words will come back when they're ready." Nora came out from the other room holding her book and gave the old woman a hard stare. "Who are you?" "I'm the nosy old woman who lives down the road." "Who are you?" "Nora Calloway. I'm 7, and I can read." "Good for you. Most grown men around here can't claim that." Hattie turned back to Ruth. "She's got some fire in her." "She surely does. She's gonna need it," Hattie said, her voice getting serious. "Now you listen to me, Ruth. I didn't ride 6 miles through the cold for a social call. I came to warn you. People are talking. An unmarried woman and a widower. Children nobody's ever seen. Gossip's brewing, and it'll get ugly. I've handled gossip before. Not out here, you haven't. Out here, a person's reputation is all they got. If the good women in town decide you're not proper, they'll freeze you out. And if anyone finds out you lied to get here, they'll use it to tear you down. And Jessie right along with you." "What are you getting at?" Hattie's voice was plain as dirt. "Marry him, Ruth. Put a ring on it before the spring thaw brings the church ladies out here looking for gossip. I have only been here 3 weeks. He hardly says a word to me. He does not need to talk. He needs to protect you, and you need to protect him. A marriage license makes it all proper. It gives you a legal claim. It makes those little girls his responsibility in the eye of the law." Hattie leaned in. "And it makes it a whole lot harder for anyone to take them from you." Those words hit Ruth like a bucket of ice water. She had been so busy just trying to survive day to day, trying to earn her keep, that she never saw the bigger danger. An unmarried woman with 2 children who had no legal father, and that man Silas somewhere back there with a blood right to Nora and Emmy. "Does Jessie know about the man you are running from?" Hattie asked low. "I told him about Silas. I told him enough." "Does he know that Silas could come for those children?" "He asked if Silas had a legal claim. I told him the truth." Hattie nodded. "Good. Then he is already thinking on it. Jesse Hawkins might be a lot of things, but he is not a fool. He knows what a marriage would do. He is just too proud and too scared to say it first. I cannot just ask a man to marry me. Why in the world not? Out here we do what needs doing. Being shy is a luxury we cannot afford." The door creaked open and Jesse walked in, shaking snow from the brim of his hat. He saw the 2 of them, and his face went real still. "Y'all been talking?" "We have," Hattie said. "Sweet as pie. Like hell it was about the weather." Jesse hung up his coat. "Hattie, whatever you are stirring up, just stop." "I am not stirring. I am putting out a fire before it starts." Hattie stood and pulled on her gloves. "I have said my piece. Ruth, that coffee was the best I have had in a long time. Jesse, you are an idiot, but you are a good man." She looked over at Nora. "You keep reading, little one. Knowledge is the one thing no one can ever take from you." And just like that she was gone, leaving the house feeling twice as big and quiet. Jessie stood by the door for a minute. Ruth washed Hattie's cup, her back to him, just waiting. "She told you to marry me," he finally said. "It was not a question. She told me to protect my daughters. Same thing, coming from Hattie." Ruth dried her hands and turned to face him. "Well, is she wrong?" Jesse pulled out a chair and sat down hard, the wood groaning under his weight. He looked at this woman who had been in his house for 3 weeks and had somehow already changed everything. It was not just cleaner. The house felt like someone was living in it, instead of just slowly dying. "If Silas comes," Jesse said, his voice flat, "if he finds you here unmarried, he will take those girls. Any judge would give them to a blood relative over a woman in your position. I know. But if you are my wife, if those girls have a stepfather with a ranch and a name in this county, Silas has not got a leg to stand on. I know that too. Then you know what I am about to say." Ruth sat down across from him. "Say it anyway. I am not asking because I want a wife," Jesse said, his hands flat on the table. "Not because of romance or anything like that. I am asking because those 2 little girls in there deserve to be safe. And the only way I can make sure of it is to make them mine in the eyes of the law. So you are proposing. I am offering you my name for you and the girls. In return, you keep doing what you have been doing. You run this house and you care for things." He stopped, struggling for words. Ruth's eyes started to burn. "What about Margaret?" Jesse flinched like he had been struck. "You still love her. You talk to her through the walls at night. How is a dead woman going to feel about you marrying a stranger?" "Margaret would tell me to stop being a fool and do the right thing," Jesse said, his voice cracking just once. "She was a practical woman. She would look at those girls and say, 'Jesse Hawkins, you protect them. That is what a man does.' And that is all this is. Protection." "I have conditions," Ruth said. "Name them. The girls will call you what they want when they are ready. Especially Emmy. You do not push. Agreed. And this marriage is on paper. It does not mean we share a bedroom. Not until we are both ready for that." His jaw tightened. "Agreed. I would not expect anything less. One more thing." Ruth leaned closer. "You have to stop apologizing to Margaret's ghost for still being alive. She is gone, Jesse. She would want you to live, not be half in the grave with her." Jesse went silent. The only sound was the fire crackling and Nora's soft voice reading a story to her sister in the other room. "That is a hard thing to ask." "Everything worth doing is hard," Ruth said. "You told me that yourself." He was quiet for a long time. Then he reached his hand across the old wooden table. It lay there, palm up, a farmer's hand, calloused and scarred, but steady. Ruth looked at that hand. A hand that had built this house, buried a wife, and pulled her own daughter out of a blizzard. She placed her hand in his. "When the road's clear," Jesse said, "we will get the circuit preacher. Just us, the girls, and Hattie." "That is enough," Ruth whispered. His fingers closed around hers. "I cannot promise I will love you. I do not know if I have that left in me." "I'm not asking for love," she said. "I'm asking for a chance. Can you give me that?" "I can try. Then I will try too." And they just sat there, holding hands across the table. They were not making promises about love, but about survival. They were choosing to fight for something together. From the other room, Nora's voice was clear, telling a story about a bear who found a warm den in the winter. And on a piece of paper in her lap, little Emmy was drawing a picture. It was a house with 4 people standing close together, almost home. The preacher came on the first clear day of March. He was a skinny man named Reverend Amos Crane who rode a mule. Jesse met him at Hattie's and brought him back to the ranch. Ruth dressed the girls in their best clothes. Nora wore a blue ribbon Hattie had brought, and Emmy held tight to her little wooden horse. Ruth wore Margaret's wedding dress. She found it folded away in a trunk. It was simple cream cotton, and it fit her perfectly. When Jesse saw her, he just stopped breathing. "I can change," Ruth said quickly. "No." His voice was rough. "Do not change." She would want it to be worn. Hattie came with a jar of honey, and Tom, Jesse's ranch hand, stood by the fireplace holding a little bunch of wildflowers he must have walked miles to find. The whole ceremony took maybe 4 minutes. The Reverend spoke the words. Jesse said, "I do." His eyes locked on Ruth. And Ruth said, "I do," looking right back at him, her own eyes full of fear and gratitude, and just a little bit of hope. "You may kiss the bride," the preacher announced. Jesse leaned in, and Ruth met him for a quick, proper kiss. It felt more like sealing a deal than a passionate moment. Nora watched with her arms folded while Emmy scribbled on a hidden piece of paper. "Well, that's done," Hattie said, dabbing her eyes. The name Ruth Hawkins felt new and lighter. For the first time, they all ate supper together. Stories were told. And for a moment, Nora even laughed. Later, after the house was quiet, Jesse spoke from his doorway. "I meant what I promised," he said. "Nothing changes unless you want it to." "I know," Ruth replied. "Good night." Two doors closed, but the distance between them felt a little smaller now. After the wedding, things settled into a quietness that felt a lot like peace. Jesse started spending his evenings inside, a silent but comforting presence at the kitchen table. He patiently answered Nora's questions about the ranch. For Emmy, he left small gifts, like a smooth stone or a new piece of charcoal for her drawings. Emmy gathered them without a word, but her pictures started to change. The fourth person in her drawing slowly moved closer to the other three. Ruth found one drawing with all four figures inside a house, with thick smoke pouring from the chimney. "She told me the smoke means the house is warm and safe," Nora explained. "It will be," Ruth vowed, though she knew promises were easily broken by men like Silas. Trouble rolled in that April in an envelope from a St. Louis law office. Jesse handed it to her while she was hanging laundry. "Go on, open it," she said. "No more secrets between us." Ruth watched his face turn to stone as he read the words. It was a look she was learning meant danger. "Silas filed a petition," he said, his voice low. "He wants custody of Nora and Emmy." The ground felt like it gave way beneath her. "On what grounds?" "Abandonment. He's telling the court you're an unfit mother." He looked straight at her. "He's hired a good lawyer, Ruth. They want the girls brought back to Missouri for a hearing." "No," she breathed, the word like a gunshot. "He terrorized them. He drove us out. He does not get to take them." "The law cares about what is on paper," Jesse said. "And he filed this before we were married, before my name was on their adoption papers. Our marriage changes the whole fight. But is it enough? We will find out. We need a lawyer. We cannot afford that." "We will." Jesse's voice was like steel. "Nobody's taking those girls, not while I am breathing." Ruth was stunned. This practical man was ready to go to war for children that were not his. "You mean that?" "I have never meant anything more." "Silas has money. This could get ugly." "Then we will get ugly right back," he vowed. "We have a daughter who can tell a judge the truth about Silas Calloway. I will not put Nora through that." "We might have to." The familiar fear crept back in that no matter what, Silas would win. Jesse stepped closer. "Look at me, Ruth." She met his gaze. "I did not just marry you. I married Nora and Emmy, too. Their broken pieces are my pieces now. They are mine." Ruth took the letter. The legal language was cold and cruel, painting her as a reckless mother. "He knows our location," she whispered. "Seems so," Jesse said. "How?" "No telling. Male roots, someone talking. It is hard to disappear completely. I need to tell Nora. Not yet. Let me find a lawyer in town. We need a plan. Then we tell her. Together." The word together sounded strange but strong. The next day, Jesse rode out and came back with a lawyer's name, Arthur Blaine, a man who handled everything from land disputes to stolen cattle. Jesse told her Blaine was a fair man who owed him a favor, but the news he brought back chilled Ruth to the bone. He said a young fellow with dark hair was in town asking around for a woman named Calloway, and her two little girls said he was from Missouri. Ruth had to sit down. Her legs felt like they'd give out. Jesse figured the man was hired by her brother-in-law, Silas, to find out if she was here. Once he knew, Silas would either come himself or send the law. They only had days, maybe a week at most. Ruth put her hands on the table to keep them from shaking. Jesse said they had to get out in front of it. He had Blaine filing papers the next day, documenting her marriage and his adoption of the girls. He promised to stand between Silas and those children, not with fists, but with his good name and reputation. He told her that his word, the word of a man known all over the territory, carried more weight than some rich fellow with a lawyer. It had to, but children have a way of finding things out. Ruth walked into the girls' room, and there was Nora, holding the letter, her face pale. She'd found it in Jesse's coat pocket, and as she asked if Uncle Silas was coming to get them, she called Jesse Papa. It was the first time. The word hit Ruth harder than any fist. This man she was afraid of was about to take them from the first father her daughter had ever claimed. Ruth promised they wouldn't let him. Nora, bless her heart, wasn't scared. She said she'd tell the judge everything. She would tell them how her uncle yelled, how he came to their room, and how he scared her little sister Emmy so bad that she stopped talking altogether. That little girl, who'd carried her own daddy's last wish for 2 long years, was ready for a fight. She'd walked through a blizzard. She could sure talk to a judge. Ruth just held her daughter, a fierce little girl with more courage than any grown-up she knew. The door at the hall's end creaked open. Jesse was standing there, and Ruth saw right away he had heard everything. His eyes went from Nora to the letter, then back to her face. That one word she said was still hanging in the air. "Did you just call me Papa?" Nora stood tall. "Yes, I know I do not have to. I want to." She looked him square in the eye. "You gave us safety. You married Mama for us, and now you are fixin' to fight Uncle Silas. My real daddy would have called you a good man." Jesse leaned against the door frame, trying to hold himself together. He finally spoke, his voice firm. "Nobody is taking you from this house, Nora. Not him, not a judge, not anybody." Nora walked right up to him and wrapped her arms around his waist. Jesse's hands, unsure at first, came to rest on her shoulders, holding her gentle but strong. Ruth could not help the tears. A little noise came from the corner. Emmy was there, holding that wooden horse tight to her chest. She watched her sister hug Jesse, her eyes wide. Then, slow as molasses, she walked across the room. She came right up to Jesse and took hold of his hand, wrapping her small fist around just 2 of his fingers. He looked down, and his guarded expression just cracked wide open. "Well," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I guess that settles it." Emmy whispered something soft. Nora, choking back tears, repeated it for them. "She says you are not cold anymore." Jesse closed his eyes, his big hand gently closing around Emmy's. "No," he breathed. "I reckon I am not." They stood there, a family, ready for whatever was coming their way. Later that night, Ruth stood in the hall and made a choice. She knocked on Jesse's door. He opened it, his boots off, but still fully dressed. He just looked at her, waiting. "I do not want to sleep by myself tonight," Ruth said. "Not because I'm afraid. I'm just tired of having doors between us." He stepped aside, and she walked in. His room was simple, with a picture of his late wife, Margaret, on the dresser. "I am not trying to replace her," Ruth said softly. "I know, but I am here for you." His hand trembled as he gently touched her face. "I ain't good at this, Ruth, at talking about feelings." "Then let me in," she whispered. He kissed her then, a real kiss full of need and hope. It was not proper like their wedding kiss. It was honest. She kissed him back, letting go of all the fear and showing him the one truth she could not deny. She loved this hard-headed, heartbroken man. "Stay," he mumbled against her lips. "I am staying," she promised, looking right into his eyes. "Tonight, and all the nights to come." Later, as they lay in the dark, his arm holding her close, Ruth knew she had to say it. "Jesse, no matter what happens with Silas, I need you to know. I did not come here looking for love. I was just trying to survive. You gave me both. She pressed her hand to his heart. I love you, not for the protection, but because of who you are. The kind of man who carves a toy horse and waits patiently for a scared little girl to trust him. He was quiet for a long while. Then his arm pulled her even closer. I love you too, he said, the words sounding like they were pulled from someplace deep inside him. I fought it hard, but you showed up here with your girls and a whole lot of trouble, and you made this house better. You made me better. We made each other better, he agreed. Ruth closed her eyes. The real fight was coming tomorrow. But tonight she was safe. Her girls were safe, and she was home. She had learned that home ain't something you find. It is something you build with someone brave enough to build it with you. That someone arrived on a Tuesday. Ruth was at the kitchen table with Nora when she heard the horses coming up the road moving fast. One look out the window and her heart froze. It was Silas. She knew his shadow from a mile away. Nora, take Emmy to the back room and lock that door. Now! Nora saw the look on her mother's face and did as she was told without a word. Ruth took off her apron, set it on the table, and walked out onto the porch. She stood tall and waited for the devil to ride into her yard. Silas pulled up his horse. He looked harder, meaner. With him was a man in a suit, a lawyer, no doubt. Ruth, Silas said with that snake-like smile she remembered. Country life suits you. But last I heard, this is Hawkins' property. You are just the help. Get off my land, Silas. The lawyer stepped forward. Mrs. Hawkins, I am Gerald Pwitt. We have a court order for the children. Silas just laughed. Your lawyer, some backwoods hack? Is that who is protecting my brother's girls? Just then the barn door slid open. Jesse walked out with Tom behind him. He did not rush, but Ruth saw his hand was ready near his side. He had been expecting this. Jesse came to stand right beside Ruth on the porch. Calloway, he said, his voice low. You are on my land. And you are hiding my nieces, Silas shot back. I am their blood, Silas insisted. Their mother stole them and ran to this wasteland. She brought them to safety, Jesse countered. Something your house was lacking from what I hear. Silas's smile twitched. Ruth has always been one for tall tales. She left out of pure spite. She left because you terrified her little girl into silence, Jesse stated flatly. Ruth's voice sliced through the tension. She was not quiet before you, Silas. She used to sing every single morning. She has not sung a note in 8 months, all because of you. Silas sneered. That is your side of it. The court will hear mine. Then let the court hear it, Jesse said, stepping off the porch to face him. He stood taller and broader than Silas, but it was the steel in his voice that made the other man flinch. Those girls are legally my daughters now. They have my name. This is their home, and their mother is my wife. You want a fight, you will get one in a courtroom. But you will not come to my home and threaten my family, not ever. Silas's lawyer, a man named Pwitt, tried to act all high and mighty. He said they were just asserting Mr. Calloway's rights. Jesse shot back that his rights ended when he ran 3 people out of their own home. He told the man to take his papers to Arthur Blaine, their lawyer, and get off his land. Pwitt flashed a court order, but Jesse had already checked. A piece of paper from Missouri didn't mean a thing in Wyoming territory until their own judge said so. You could see the surprise on the lawyer's face. Silas looked straight at Ruth, with that awful look she knew so well, the one that said he owned her. But Ruth stood right beside Jesse and found her voice. She told Silas he was never their family. He was their nightmare. And she promised him if he ever came near her girls again, she would tell every judge and every neighbor from Missouri to Washington what kind of monster he really was. For just a second, she saw the real rage behind his mask. With the sun high, they stood on open ground. Jessie was beside her, Tom was behind her, and inside, 2 little girls were locked up safe. Get on your horse, Jessie said to Silas, his voice low and steady. You ride to town and do this the legal way. But you are not welcome on my land. Come back without a marshal, and I will treat you like a trespasser." Silas stared at Ruth with a look colder than anger. "Henry would be ashamed of you," he spat. "Henry would have put you in the ground for harming his children." They rode off, leaving only dust. Ruth's legs gave out, and Jessie caught her. "He will not stop," she whispered. "Then we will not either," Jessie said, holding her tight. "He left without them, Ruth. That is the first win." Arthur Blaine, their lawyer, started gathering statements. Hattie gave one so fierce the clerk had to ask her to quiet down. Tom testified to the broken condition the family was in when they arrived. Even Mrs. Patterson, who had been cold to Ruth for months, signed a letter for them. Jessie sold 10 head of cattle for the legal fees and told Ruth it was not up for discussion. When the notice for a June hearing came, Ruth could not eat for 3 days. Jessie found her staring at the kitchen wall long after midnight. "What if his money is enough?" she asked. "What if they send my girls back to that house?" Jessie's voice was calm and sure. "Then I will ride to Missouri and I will bring them home. The law might fail us, Ruth, but I will not fail them." "You would break the law for children who are not your blood?" "Blood is what hurt them," Jessie said, sitting down beside her. "What I am offering is better than blood. I chose them. Every single day, I choose them." Grief had made that man quiet. Love was making him loud. The courthouse in Cheyenne was a 2-day ride. They had to leave the girls with Hattie, and Nora clung to Ruth's hand at the door. "I should be there. I should be the one to tell them what he did." "Sweetheart, you wrote it all down. The judge will read every last word," Ruth said, kneeling to look her in the eye. "My job is to protect you from that room, from having to face him. Let me do my job." Nora's lip trembled. "What if you lose?" "Then I come home and we figure out what is next, together, just like always. Promise you will come home. I promise on everything I am." Emmy stood right behind her sister, clutching her 2 wooden horses. She tugged on Ruth's sleeve and whispered something. Ruth leaned close to listen, then closed her eyes for a moment. "I will tell him, baby. I promise." She walked to Jessie at the wagon. "Emmy needs you to know something. She says you are her papa, and papas do not let the mean men win." Jessie gripped the side of the wagon, his knuckles turning white. He took a few deep breaths, then turned and crouched down, holding out his hand. Emmy walked down the steps one at a time and placed her small hand in his. Jessie looked at her with her father's brown eyes. "I will not let him win," he said to her. "That is my promise to you, Emmy Hawkins." She squeezed his fingers, then let go and ran back to Hattie. Jessie stood up, and Ruth saw a look on his face she had never seen before. It was the face of a man who had found the one thing he was willing to die for, and he was at peace with it. "Let's go," he said. The courthouse was crowded and hot. Silas sat on one side with his men. Ruth and Jessie sat on the other with their lawyer. Judge Walter Crane was a gray-bearded man who listened more than he spoke. He read every document, including all 4 pages of Nora's statement, which was read aloud by a clerk whose hands were shaking by the end. Silas's case was simple. He was a blood relative, and he had money. Blaine called Ruth to testify first. She told the truth about everything, the nights, the screaming, the door with no lock, and the morning Emmy just stopped talking. She spoke in the same steady voice she used for teaching arithmetic, and she never once looked at Silas. Then Blaine called Jessie. He walked to the front of that courtroom in his best shirt, holding his hat in his hands. He told the judge about a woman who arrived in a blizzard with 2 frozen children and a lie. He spoke about Emmy's blue lips and Nora standing guard in his barn, watching him. He told them about charcoal drawings and a 4-year-old who whispered the word warm, like it was the most precious thing in the world. "Those girls came to my house as strangers," Jessie said, looking right at the judge. "They are leaving as my daughters. I watched them learn to trust again after the man who was supposed to protect them broke that trust into little pieces. I am not a perfect man, Your Honor. But I chose these girls. I choose them every morning when I wake up and every night when I check on their room. That is not blood," Jessie finished. It is better than blood. It is a decision a man makes every single day. The courtroom was completely silent. The judge held up his hand. "Mr. Calloway," he said, turning to Silas, "I'm going to ask you one question. Did you enter the bedroom of your deceased brother's wife after dark with the intent of intimidating her?" Silas brushed off his lawyer, who was whispering in his ear. "It was my property," he said. "That was not my question," the judge said calmly. "Did the child, Emmeline, stop speaking after these incidents began?" "I do not know when the child stopped speaking. I was not paying attention to her." The judge nodded slowly. "No, I do not imagine you were." He left for his chambers. An hour later he came back. "The petition for custody is denied. The children will remain in the legal custody of Ruth and Jesse Hawkins. Mr. Calloway, I am ordering you to have no contact with these children. Any violation will result in contempt charges." The judge read the papers and listened to both sides. Then he made his ruling. All the air went out of Ruth's lungs. Jesse's hand found hers under the table and held on tight. The judge told Silas this was all finished. He said Silas should go back to Missouri and grieve his brother instead of tormenting his children. Just like that, Silas walked out. The door closed, and Ruth finally started to cry. Jesse pulled her close, right there in the courthouse, and just held her. On the 2-day ride back to the ranch, Ruth felt a strange new feeling. Safety. Real, legal safety. A judge had said her daughters were hers. The man beside her had stood up in court and claimed them as his own without even blinking. When they came over the last ridge, they saw smoke from the chimney and 2 little figures on the porch. Nora and Emmy saw the wagon and came running down to meet them. Nora climbed up into the wagon before it even stopped. She asked, "Did we win, Mama? Did we win?" Ruth hugged her so tight she could hardly breathe and said, "We won, baby. We won." Jesse climbed down, and little Emmy, who had been silent for so long, just looked up at him. Jesse knelt down, and Emmy reached up with both her little arms. He picked her up and settled her against his chest. And then she put her head on his shoulder, wrapped her arms around his neck, and said a word, clear as day. "Papa." It was loud enough for them all to hear. Jesse Hawkins, a man who hadn't cried since he buried his own family, just closed his eyes and let the tears run down his face. He held Emmy to his heart. Nora pressed against his side, and Ruth put her arms around all of them. They just stood there in the yard as the sun went down, a family, whole and finally safe. That night, after the girls were asleep, Ruth found Jesse on the porch. He told her, his voice all rough, that he'd hear that word, Papa, for the rest of his life. Ruth leaned on his shoulder. She reminded him that just 3 months ago he didn't even want children. He turned to her and said that 3 months ago, most days he didn't even want to be alive. Now, he said, he had more than he deserved, and he was going to spend the rest of his life trying to earn it. Jesse told her she didn't have to earn it, just keep choosing it. He promised he would every single day. And in their room, Nora lay awake, listening to the quiet of a house with no more screaming, no more pounding on doors. She whispered to her sleeping sister, "We're home, Emmy. We're really home." On the floor, a child's drawing showed 4 people holding hands, and above them, one single word: family. Ruth Hawkins stood on her own porch with a good husband and 2 safe children. This wasn't a home she'd been given. It was a home she had fought for. This was no fairy tale. It was a story about a woman who refused to give up, a man who chose to be kind when it would have been easier to turn away, and 2 little girls who taught everyone what it meant to be brave. It was a story about how a cold Wyoming winter could lock 4 strangers together and turn them into a family. The lock on the bedroom door was just a piece of metal now, something nobody needed anymore. Ruth closed her eyes and breathed it all in. She had built something real and lasting out of nothing but wreckage and winter. And 2 simple words a little girl had given her like a gift. Warm. Papa. That was enough. That was everything. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.